Good morning, students. Our session of Financial Management 1. Now, as far as our previous session was concerned, in the last session we have discussed about the meaning of debentures. Now, in that session we already discussed the introduction part of debenture, then after the elements of debentures, types of debentures, advantages and limitations of debentures. In previous session we have discussed about shares, that is equity shares and preference shares. So I think you all are clear about both the terms, both the sources of finance, that is shares and debentures. Today we are going to discuss about the basic difference between debentures and shares. The first point is under shares, the amount of capital of the company is divided in the small parts. Thus, each part is known as shares. As we know that the whole own issued capital is divided into a small part of the capital, and that small part, each part is known as shares. In debenture is a document in writing acknowledging company's indebtedness for a certain sum. Now, as compared to shares, debenture is a document which is issued by organization, and the main purpose of debenture, that is to raise borrowed capital in the market. So it is not divided into small part. When you are going to issue the own capital, so organization is able to divide their own capital into small parts, so that company is able to attract maximum to maximum investors for their investment purpose. Now here in debenture, organization is going to create their borrowed capital in the market. So it is a kind of documents which gives the acknowledgement about the borrowed fund which is going to be raised by the organization. The second point, company obtains ownership capital through issue of shares. In debenture, company obtains borrowed capital through the issue of debentures. Then after the next one, that is equity share is ownership security, and debenture is creditship security. Through debenture, company create the credit fund in the market, and through equity, company create own capital in the market. Then after the next point, as per this status, shareholder have wide right. They have the right to vote. Equity shareholders get the right to vote in annual general meeting because they are the real owner of the organization. because they provide their own capital. While in debenture, as per the status, debenture holders have very limited rights, and truly speaking, debenture holders do not have a right to vote. They have no voting rights as compared to equity shareholders, because debenture holders are the creditors of the organization, and creditors have no right in the management. Then after the next one, dividend is related to the profit of the business. If profits are not enough or there is no profit, dividend is not distributed. As far as equity shares are concerned, company does not have any liability, that is to pay a compulsory dividend to their shareholders. If a company earns more, if they have the additional profit, then and then company is going to declare the dividend. But as per the Companies Act, as per the law, company is not liable to pay a compulsory dividend to their shareholders. While in debenture, interest on debenture has to be paid irrespective of whether the company make profit or loss. They has to pay dividend. Debentures are the liability for the organization, because the debentures are the borrowed capital. Once company raises their fund through the borrowed capital, when the company create their credit capital in the market, at that time it is a duty of organization, that is to pay a proper interest on debenture. Whatever the situation of the company, if the company makes profit or no profit, it is compulsory for them to pay interest on debenture, and that interest must be paid timely and on a regular interval of time. The next point, company raises ownership capital. In equity, company create their own capital in the market. While in debenture, company raises their liability. Company raises the responsibility because company going to issue the borrowed fund in the market. Then after, there is more risk in shares, because equities are very risky capital. So it is very difficult to attract each and every class of each and every class of investors, and convince them to invest in equities. In debenture, the risk element is nil, because debenture is highly secured and the risk perception in debenture is very low. Then after, the next point is shareholders have the control over the company's management because they have the voting rights, and through the voting rights shareholders are able to change the decision of management. Now in debenture holders do not have a control over the management of company because debentures are the creditors of the company. They are the third person. They are the outsider. So debenture holders does not have any voting rights in the company. So debenture holders are not going to influence the management by taking different decisions. Then after the next point, except of redeemable preference shares, company cannot refund share capital in its lifetime. Company is not going to return back the share capital to shareholders. But except redeemable preference shares, they are going to return the capital to shareholders. In debenture is debt of the company which has to be refunded after a certain period of time. In debenture, company is going to return the debt capital after the completion of maturity. So, when the term of debenture expires, at that time, company is going to return the debt capital to their owner. The next point, by issuing shares, the question of burden does not arise because how can it mortgage one's own asset? At the time of issuing equity shares, organization is not going to put any assets on mortgage because equities are the ownership capital. So, how? Or there is no question of mortgage as far as the ownership capital is concerned. In debenture, the company can issue debentures by mortgaging the asset as security. Thus, it creates a burden on a company. Now, it is required to mortgage the asset at the time of issuing debt capital. So, when the mortgage is there, it will create a burden on a company. If company fails to pay the main capital to debenture holders, so the mortgage assets will be on the heavy risk. So in debenture, the burden is created at the time of issuing debt capital. So it's all about the difference between shares and debentures. Now I am going to explain you the difference between equity shares and preference shares. It is not there in the slides. Only oral discussion will be there. So please be attentive. Prepare a note and write down in your notebook. And I think it is very easy difference between equities and preference. You can easily differentiate its characteristic by taking the introductory session of equities and preference in detail. So, start with the difference between equities and preference. First point, the shares on which the right to get back dividend and capital is next to preference share in priority are called equity shares. So when you are going to compare equity and preference, the first preference is given to preference shareholders on the payment of dividend and on the payment of capital. After paying the dividend and capital to preference shares, the next preference is given to the equity shares. In preference shares, the shares on which the right to get dividend and capital on the main priority are known as preference shares. Then after second point, the right to receive dividend and refund of capital at the time of liquidation of the company is after the preference shares holder have to be paid off is known as equity shares. In preference shares, the right to receive dividend and refund of capital at the time of liquidation of the company is before equity shareholders are paid off is known as preference shares. Then after the third point, right to get back capital at the last moment. If company goes into liquidation, it has a right to get back capital only after preference share capital is returned. In preference share, if company goes into the liquidation, preference shareholder has the right or the priority to get back the capital first. The next point, the rate of dividend on equity shares is not fixed. In preference, the rate of dividend on preference shares is fixed. The next point is the rate of dividend is connected with the profit. There is a fluctuation in the market price of equity shares. In preference share, there is not much fluctuation in the market price because it does not related with the rate of dividend of preference share capital. Next point, equity shareholder get many rights such as voting rights, remaining present in annual general meeting of the company, and so on. In preference shareholders does not get any rights, that is a right to vote and right to present in annual general meeting, because preference shareholders does not share equity capital of the company. The next point, in general meeting, equity shareholders can elect directors and auditors of the organization. Means they have a right to appoint directors and equity holders. They have a right to appoint directors and auditors. In preference shares holders do not have a right to elect directors and auditors of the company. The next one, in equity share, any type of company can issue equity shares. If company has not specified the types of shares, then all the shares are automatically considered as ordinary shares. In preference, any type of company cannot issue preference shares. Moreover, there is no compulsion to issue preference shares. Next point, company cannot redeem equity share capital during its lifetime. In preference, the company can refund the capital of redeemable preference shares only. Company is going to return the capital of redeemable preference shares only. Then after, equity shares have to be purchased by the directors of the company as qualifying shares in order to become directors. In preference shares cannot be considered to be qualifying shares to become directors of the company. Means, by purchasing preference shares, no one is able to become directors of the company. The next point, the investors who are the risk taker prefer equity shares because the risk element in equity share is very high. In preference share, investors who are the risk seeker they are going to prefer an investment in preference share because preference share gives a regular dividend to their shareholders. So, risk seeker investors prefer investment in preference shares. Then after, the last one, company does not give a proper or a fixed regular dividend to their equity shareholders. So, it is very risky capital. While in preference shares, company promises to give a fixed dividend to their preference shareholders. So, the risk element is very low as compared to equities. So, these are the main points of difference between ordinary shares and preference shares. I hope the difference is clear to each and everyone. And make sure in your examinations the difference will be there of 7 to 8 marks in any short note form. So here I am ending my session, and in the next session we are going to discuss about loan financing companies, how these companies are working in our Indian economy. And then after, we are going to discuss about internal financial sources. Hope you all are clear about each and every points, and it is really very easy one. You have already studied the basic concepts of shades and debentures in 11th and 12th standard. So it will become easy for you to study this particular unit. Thank you so much.